So when you look at the situation in the Donetsk Oblast in Ukraine, you see the fighting, you see the front lines, you see Bakhmut, back and forth between the Ukrainians and the Russians, specifically Wagner Group, in that region. But it seems like President Putin and his allies within the Russian military echelons are using the region as a political chessboard now, as Putin seems to be trying to sideline political competitors by pushing them to the front line. And this is based on an analysis conducted by the Institute for the Study of War. Now, forces under Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov, who is an adamant Putin supporter and has his own military, albeit a ragtag military, were instructed to deploy to the Donetsk Oblast to increase their operations there. Now, the Putin administration, yes, could be pressuring Kadyrov to adopt an offensive stance in the conflict to fill the vacuum left behind by Wagner Group, since Ukrainian forces are actually advancing now from the north and the south, which is putting the Russian military holdouts that fought with Wagner Group in a pretty precarious position there. So as Kadyrov's forces, his Chechen forces, step up, Wagner Group mercenaries under Prigozhin are stepping back from Bakhmut. And this is after months and months of combat with significant losses to Wagner Group. Now, this shift coincides with the friction between the mercenary group and the conventional Russian military regarding supply issues, which adds another layer to this political drama, especially since Kadyrov and Prigozhin are friends. Now, Moscow's decision to rotate rear echelon Chechen troops to the front line indicates a potential manpower issue. The Kremlin seems to be avoiding deploying fresh troops, but instead are utilizing those that are already in Ukraine. So the Chechen forces didn't actually leave the battlefield. They just were operating in the rear echelon for the past 12 months or so. Now, Kadyrov's forces are not going to adequately replace the sizable and seasoned Wagner mercenaries, and the Kremlin could be exploiting this to weaken the Prigozhin-Kadyrov partnership that has largely bothered Shoigu and the rest of the Russian standard military. Now, this shift in the deployment comes after Kadyrov's forces did pause from high-intensity combat for nearly a year, mainly staying behind enemy lines to conduct rear echelon tactics after they actually were on the front lines in places like Mariupol and Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. So Kadyrov claims his Chechen forces have about 7,000 troops. However, they have limited combat exposure relative to the Ukrainians and relative to Wagner Group, so they're not going to necessarily be able to replace them. Couple that with their penchant for their social media posturing, and the Ukrainians have nicknamed them the TikTok Battalion. Now, Alex Kokhtarov, who's a risk analysis who specializes in Russia and Ukraine, said based on the previous deployments of the various Chechen units in 2022, they are probably not the most combat-ready troops. Despite all their social media bravado about how wonderful they are effectively a paramilitary police with a little bit extra training from the Russian military and are operating separate from the Russian Defense Ministry's chain of command. And all the engagements the Chechens were involved in early on in the war led to significant Chechen casualties. With that being said, while they do have their flashy social media profiles, these Chechen troops did fight in those cities I mentioned before, so they aren't totally inexperienced. Regardless, 7,000 Chechen troops, regardless of experience, are not going to replace 20 to 40,000 Wagner Group troops and provide an adequate defense, let alone an offense, on the front line. However, as I alluded to earlier, there may be a deeper political move here. Along with the Kremlin possibly attempting to sever ties between the friendly relations between Kadyrov and Prigozhin, Russia may be looking to reestablish federal authority over the Chechen forces. Now, this move could be a response to Kadyrov's perceived threats to Putin's control, or Putin could be punishing Kadyrov for his past defiant acts, going back 15 years, where Kadyrov largely believes he doesn't necessarily answer to Putin. And these include Chechnya exempting itself from the recent conscriptions And in 2020 or 2015, Kadyrov ordered local security forces, Chechen security forces, to fire on Russian federal troops who might arrive in Chechnya without announcing themselves to Kadyrov. Kadyrov is a vocal thorn in the side of the Kremlin nearly every month, but he is useful as a Putin ally to control Chechnya. Now, all of these factors intertwined with the military situation in the Bakhmut, Donetsk region create a pretty volatile mix with a lot of complexity, where Putin is looking to remove from the public eye both Kadyrov and Prigozhin so that he can secure himself more so within the Kremlin. And it's almost as if Putin has recognized he will not be able to win this war, so he needs to shore up his own position to remain the leader of Russia by sidelining any potential opposition, such as a Prigozhin-Kadyrov alliance against the Kremlin. So we'll have to see how this plays out, but it does seem like there's a lot more political moves involved in deploying Chechen troops rather than pulling up more regulars or other conscripts in order to both sideline potential opposition but also maintain the relative peace amongst the Moscow, St. Petersburg public that can tend to turn on a Russian leader very quickly if they don't like the way things are going.